Hello, everybody. It's really good to be here. I hope that I'm audible. I'm testing out this system too. So thank you. Do shout if my voice dips, as it may do. It's lovely to see so many people who are interested in having a think together about Gerard Manley Hopkins. Over the next 40 minutes or so, I'm going to be talking a little bit about the poet himself and his life. If it's okay with folk, I'm not assuming vast amounts of knowledge, although there may be people here who already know a good deal about him. So I apologise for that. Do feel free at the end in the questions time to add more. Please do feel free to do that. But I'm also hoping that we'll have a little bit of time to look at 2 or 3 of his poems. There's a handout for you which has got a few of his poems on there. The problem is, when it comes to thinking about Hopkins and talking about his poetry, there is such an embarrassment of riches. It's always difficult to know where to start in making a selection, but we will have a look at some of those. It seems in a way a little bit strange this afternoon to be thinking about something which is nodding us towards Lent, which is where this particular today's interest in Gerard Manley Hopkins comes in, because of course we are only just at the tail end of the Christmas season, but Lent will be upon us relatively quickly this year, so it feels more possible. A little bit about Hopkins, though, first of all, and what it is that captivated me about him and his work. I'm always interested in poetry which offers us the possibility to know ourselves more fully as human beings and to know ourselves more fully as creatures of God. And there is something about the work of Hopkins which opens a door for me in both of those areas. There was something about his poetry, for those who are unfamiliar and familiar with him, which has the possibility to open out for us something about a world which is completely and utterly filled with God's presence. And at the same time, his work shows us something about the vagaries of the human heart and what it can be like to live as God's creatures in all our motley, in all our dappled nature, the good, the difficult, the painful, the glorious. There is something about Hopkins which makes it possible to catch a glimpse of all of that in his poetry. Of course, there is also the sheer pleasure of reading his verse. It is extraordinarily life-giving and life-enhancing to read the poetry of Gerard Manley Hopkins. There is something about his creative use of language, which I'll come on to, which has the possibility to open a door for us, to open a door to something which is deeply us and more than us all at the same time. And there have been times reading Hopkins when I have found myself just laughing for no other reason that there is something at the heart of his poetry which is so life-giving, even when it explores the deepest and most painful aspects of the human condition. There's something which changes us so deeply that that sense of change has to break through in some way. And for me, that's often laughter or tears. But if you're not into Hopkins yet, don't be surprised if when you read his poetry, you find yourself reacting emotionally as well as intellectually, because he is a great poet of the intellect as well as the emotion. So, a little bit about the poet himself. As you'll see, there's an image of him on the handout, and he had this rather extraordinary sort of aquiline appearance, a slight figure. He was somebody who was born in London, in East London, grew up in London. He was born in the 1840s, and he spent all his early life in London, and he was the child of quite an articulate, erudite, quite artistic family. It was an Anglican family, and the family was quite poetic. One member of the family was into visual arts as well, so quite a richly cultured family. And it wasn't until he was a young man that he left London and he went to live in Oxford, and he went to university in Oxford. And around that time, Hopkins was investigating his own faith, his Anglican faith, and started to be drawn towards Roman Catholicism. And having encountered Newman, he was received into the Roman Catholic Church after a time of some considerable struggle, and decided that the route ahead for him would be to consider Roman Catholic orders, and he entered the Jesuit order. At this point, he had already been writing poetry himself. But what began to happen was that he felt that his own calling to the priesthood was at odds with his calling as a poet. And as a consequence, he destroyed a lot of his own early poetry. He couldn't see how these would all hang together, and he abandoned his poetic life for quite some time. But at this time, he'd gone to North Wales, and he went to St Byno's. And if anybody is familiar here with St Byno's, has been there, is thinking of going there, it is, of course, this great Jesuit centre, now a spirituality centre. Many folk of all denominations go there, and at this particular point, it was one of the heartlands of Jesuit formation in the British Isles, and he went there, and it was a time of extraordinary joy for Hopkins. He looked back later on his days there, as he used to call his salad days, when he kind of fell in love with the world around him, and his interior world opened up phenomenally at around the time that his poetic world was bubbling under again. There was also something quite important that happened to him in his theological formation in the early 70s, which I just mentioned, which is that he encountered the medieval poet Duns Scotus, and he discovered something about his theology, which I understand wasn't particularly mainstream at that point in the circles in which he was moving. He discovered something about the theology of Duns Scotus, which chimed in with his own way of perceiving the world. And that was that Hopkins had a very profound sense, the sense of a seer almost, of being able to look into the heart of things. I'll come back to that in a minute about how it was reflected in his poetry. But he could look into the heart of a door, of a person, of a plant, and have a sense of what it was that gave that thing its core, its essence. And he encountered in the theology of Duns Scotus the idea that things have their own thingness, their isness, the idea that Christ lies at the heart of each thing in such a way that it gives that thing its own specificity, its own character, its own essence. And so he found that this theology chimed with his own understanding of the world, and that started to shape him quite a lot. Now, as I mentioned, he laid aside his poetic vocation for quite some time. He couldn't see how his vocation as a poet, which was, of course, essentially born out of who he was, he couldn't see how it would cohere with a sense of service to something greater than himself. So this was a struggle for him. But something happened in the 1870s which encouraged him to think again about his poetic calling. And this was when a boat sank, and it sank off the south coast of England, sort of southeast coast of England, and it was called the Deutschland. And if you know Hopkins' poetry, you might already be thinking, I know what this is. And that the Deutschland was a ship which was carrying a group of nuns from Germany to the United States of America. And their aim was to find some kind of religious freedom to worship in the way that they wanted, where they felt they couldn't in their homeland. And the boat foundered, through some horrific storms and sank. And this was immense in the news at the day. Every day, the newspapers followed the story of the storm and the wreck and those who were found. And in fact, the nuns who perished, at least some of the nuns who perished, are now buried in the south of England. This was immense news in the Roman Catholic Church. And at this point, Hopkins decided to seek permission of his superior at St Bino's to write again. He wanted to write the poetic story of the wreck of the Deutschland. And of course, this became the very well-known epic, The Wreck of the Deutschland. When he wrote this poem, and it is long, it's many, many verses. When he wrote this poem, it was never actually published at the time because his superior thought it was too a bit too wild and woolly, a bit too modern to be published. And of course, now we read it and it's so much of its time, but it's of a poetic time that Hopkins created in a way. But at that point, it was really quite revolutionary. And it was revolutionary in terms of its language, its tone, its theme. And so it was regarded as much too radical. And it was possibly because in the years when Hopkins had been away from poetry, it hadn't just completely lain dormant within him. He had quietly been discovering a new poetic voice inside himself. And this was a voice which was born of a whole range of different influences, which I'll come to again in a minute. Different influences, and he was starting to use language differently, to use verse differently. He had new ideas about poetry, and all of this began to find expression in The Wreck of the Deutschland, which is an extraordinarily mature, epic poem, especially for one so young. As I said, this wasn't published, but it's as if the floodgates had already opened by then. And over the next few years, this is just a bit of a trot through his life. Over the next few years, whilst he was at St Bino's, he wrote possibly his greatest period of religious poetry. And when I say his greatest period, there was some very, very, very complex religious poetry later on, but at this point it was an explosion of a sense of God with us in the world. It's as if he couldn't look around him but to see God's presence in the world. And this characterised everything that he wrote whilst he was at St Bino's. In a while, we'll look at one of the poems from those days, one of his best-known poems. Sadly, his period at St Bino's was always going to come to an end. It was a time of training, and it became the time to leave for him in the late 1870s. And this was partly because he just missed getting the exam marks he needed to stay on to be an academic theologian in that context, much as he wanted to be. And he left in the late 1870s, and started a number of years as a priest and a teacher. And he travelled a lot. And I think over a certain period of time, over the next 3 or 4 years, he was in multiple places. He moved every few months. There was a period when over about 18 months, he moved to about 4 different places. Often as a teacher, he taught in places like Stonyhurst College, but also as a parish priest. And this time as a parish priest was quite a searing time for him. He often found himself sent to places which were part of the industrial heartland of the country at this point, which was, of course, deep in the Industrial Revolution, in manufacturing, and he was often around the northwest. He went to Manchester, Liverpool, Sheffield, and all areas around then, and found himself repeatedly in places where he really struggled. He struggled with the pollution. He struggled with how degrading life was for many people. He struggled with the poverty. Although he did say that the people in these places were wonderful. He loved the people. he struggled with the places. And for somebody who found God so much in the countryside, perhaps it's to be understood that this was a struggle for him. And we know all of this partly because of his poetry, but also because Hopkins left us a wealth of correspondence. And one of his greatest pen pals, if you like, was Robert Bridges, who was his best friend throughout his life, who he had met when he was at university. And Robert Bridges, of course, became the poet laureate. And whilst Robert Bridges didn't share the same religious aesthetic as Hopkins, they were great friends, great correspondents. They critiqued each other's work, and we find great outpourings in Hopkins' letters to Bridges about how he experienced everywhere that he was visiting. In fact, we have Robert Bridges to be really grateful to for the publication of Hopkins' work, because apart from tiny bits and bobs, it wasn't until a very, very long time after Hopkins died that his poetry was published, first in a collection by Robert Bridges. So he is not only a great ally to Hopkins, but to us, if we're interested at all in Hopkins' work. As the years went by, his poetry, Hopkins' poetry, became more light in shade, more motley, if you like. And this was partly because he also had the capacity to experience the deep darkness of what was around him to quite a phenomenal degree. I mentioned how he responded to the contexts he was in. He also was often troubled in his own spirits. He was often cast low. He had sleepless nights. He appeared to have experienced very deep moods of depression. Again, we know this partly from his letters to Robert Bridges, but also as his poetry reflected more and more life's struggles. I know there are some folk who write about Hopkins and suggest, oh, he was just writing about life struggles. It wasn't necessarily his struggles. I kind of can't help thinking they were his struggles because of the sheer visceral, poignant depth of his writing. It was the writing of somebody who had lived through these struggles. And his very last posting of all was to spend 5 years in one place, which brought him a degree of stability, absolutely. But it was a time when he was perhaps most troubled in his spirits, when he suffered really poor health, and when he found the work drudgery and very debilitating. And there were times when he never questioned his vocation per se, but he did question what his purpose was in doing what he was doing. And he was an academic, and he was at Trinity College, Dublin, and he was a fellow in classics around that time as well. He had two sort of coterminous academic posts in Dublin, and there was a lot of marking, a lot of exam setting. He found it very debilitating. And his health began to break down too. And after only a few years, his health broke down so much that when he became deeply ill, he was not able to recover. And he died in his 40s, obviously, very, very sadly. A young life cut short, whose poetic output was nonetheless extraordinary. Now, it's possible, I may just be being slightly optimistic about this, it's possible to see a slightly new tone entering his poetry towards the end of his life, where you get a glimpse of something new about to happen from these ebbs and flows, something slightly resurrection-y towards the end of his life. I'm willing to be argued with about any of this. Whatever take I have on Hopkins' poetry, there will be a million other takes. So if you don't agree, that's absolutely fine. But there is something about the final poems which emerged just as his life was coming to an end, when we possibly get a hint of something new happening then. Now, I'm going to spend just a couple of minutes, if I may, reminding us all of some of the great creative gifts of his poetry before we have a look at a couple of his poems. He was, as I said, very creative. He was a brilliant technician, first of all. He was steeped in poetic theory. He was steeped in the classics. He was also fascinated by some of the great and unusual poetic traditions, like Cynhennedd. He was a great advocate of the Welsh poetic tradition of Cynhennedd, which is incredibly complex and has all sorts of interior rules and regulations about how many syllables you can have and what sort of rhymes and quarter rhymes you can have. I won't go into the detail here, partly because I don't fully understand it myself. But he was a great advocate of it. And even though he said he didn't always fully understand it, there's the echo of this rhythmic language in his poetry. But he also gave us something which we regard as a Hopkins creation, which is sprung rhythm. He said that comes from all the other influences around him, from Cynhennedd to Anglo-Saxon verse to vernacular speech. And the principle of sprung rhythm, which was really groundbreaking at the time, was that whereas traditional poetry counted the numbers of stresses and consonants in a line, so every single word had its consonants counted in order to create the rhythm. His idea of stress and rhythm was totally different. He only counted the stresses. So he'd say every single consonant in a sentence would have specific single stresses. So you could have any number of consonants. He only counted the stresses, which means that the length of lines changes and flows, and it follows a bit more like normal speech, about how we would speech. That's one thing he gave us. The other thing are these notions of what he called inscape and instress. Now, we could spend the entire rest of the afternoon talking about that, so just one liner for each. I mentioned earlier that he had this sense of being able to see deeply into things. It's as if he could almost touch the essence of something. That thing which he felt he was seeing was the thing's inscape. So you would have your own inscape. This microphone would have its own inscape. Every single thing has its own essence, which Hopkins said is its God-given essence. And it's not even that the chair has an inscape, it's that particular chair has its own inscape. Another chair has its own inscape. So it's very, very specific, his notion of something having its own identity. And then the term instress is more difficult to define in a way. The easiest way for me to think about it is it's that way that we experience the inscape of something else. It's how we apprehend it. And this could be how we feel it, how we see it, how we sense something. And as a consequence, we receive it and are formed by it. So at a very basic level, there is the door there. The door has its own inscape. I have an experience of the door, and that is my instressing of the door's essence. I take it into myself. He talked a lot about instress, taking things into himself. And so that's a very particular Hopkins way of seeing things, this apprehension of the isness of something else. So when he wrote poetry, what he was trying to do is to give us an experience of a thing. And because of that, he doesn't so much go for similes. He goes for language which might break meaning open for us so that we can kind of grasp it in here rather than say, oh yeah, that's like that, so that. We might say, yes, this word is completely new and different. It does something completely new to me and it gives me an experience of a thing. So these are very Hopkinsy approaches. There is so much more to think about and know about with Hopkins. So I would encourage you, if you feel moved to think and know more about Hopkins, to do so. I think it's time we looked at a little bit of poetry. So I'm hoping I can read this. What I'm going to do is suggest we start. We're going to have a look at maybe a couple of poems is what we have time for. And the first thing we're going to look at is the Windhover. I'm going to read it, probably not as well as it should be read, but I'm going to read it and then give us a few seconds to have a sit and a think with it, and then offer some thoughts. This is the Windhover, to Christ our Lord. I caught this morning morning's minion, kingdom of daylight's dauphin, dappled dawn drawn falcon, in his riding of the rolling level, underneath him steady air, and striding high there. How he rung upon the rein of a wimpling wing in his ecstasy, then off, forth on swing, as a skate's heel sweeps smooth on a bow bend, the hurl and gliding rebuffed the big wind. My heart in hiding stirred for a bird, the achieve of, the mastery of the thing. Brute, beauty and valour and act, oh, air, pride, plume, here, buckle, and the fire that breaks from thee then, a billion times told lovelier, more dangerous, oh, my chevalier. No wonder of it. Sheer plod makes plough down Sicilian shine, and blue bleak embers. Ah, my dear. Sorry. Fall, gold themselves, and gash, gold, vermilion. I do apologise, there's always that, be poetry like this. Right, so the Windhover, it's probably on one level quite familiar. It's one of his big poems, and he regarded it at one time anyway, when he wrote to his friend Robert Bridges. He said, it's the best thing I ever wrote. It's only a couple of years after he'd written it, though, that he put under the title to Christ our Lord. It wasn't part of his initial attribution, if you like. So there is something about this which gives us a sense of a lot of what we've been hearing about so far. It was written when he was living at St. Bino's. And it was written on a day when he was walking early over the hillsides, and he saw this bird of prey, the Windhover. And he had a response to it. And he looked really, really deeply at what was going on. And he had this sense, which he'd written about and often carried, that the more you look at something, the more it looks back at you, and you are transformed in this mutual regard. So when he saw this bird, what he saw was something by which he felt transformed. And if you can imagine this extraordinary bird of prey, it's on the wind. First of all, it's gliding on the currents. So he talks about the wind above and below the wings, and this bird is hovering and gliding on the currents. And he talks about the wimpling wing, and what you get is the sense of the feathers vibrating in the wind. So you see this bird drifting on the wind, a kind of a master of all it surveys. And so the language is about kingship. It's about it's the chevalier, it's the knight, it's something which has this power and majesty. It's the sun in every sense of the word. For him, it's this great picture of the world's glory in the air. And then we see these sort of images of how the bird turns and spins. So there's some falconry imagery in there for one thing, and that's to do with if you have a falcon on a string, it kind of moves. It moves in kind of circles and rises. It's also on the wind. It's moving round and rising up. But there's another image in this, which is of a skater. And so if you see a skater moving low around a corner and it goes to one side and it skates around and up again, the bird is doing that as well. So you get this sense of the bird moving and moving and moving and then up, and the bird flies off as if on the force of the air, the current. And it's as if the bird is both master and subject to the air. So there's this whole sense of what's going on at the very heart of the natural world. And then this is a sonnet, so very traditionally in a sonnet, there's a shift in tone and mood and style after the first 8 lines. So you get the volta moving into the next part of the poem. And what we get then is something else completely. Get a kind of slightly more reflective on the nature of what's going on here. He says, brute beauty and valour and act, oh, air, pride, plume, here, buckle. It's like the language starts to break up. Something new is happening. The sense of coherence starts to shift. And this word buckle has so many meanings attached to it potentially. Is it that the bird is kind of girding its loins, buckling up, or is it buckling under the force of the wind? And then the sense that if it buckles, he says, and the fire that breaks from thee then, it's as if under pressure, under stress, something new happens. There is new life, new fire, new brightness at this point of stress when the patterns are starting to break up a bit. And he says, 1,000,000,000 times lovelier, more dangerous. The fire that breaks from us when we're under stress is extraordinary, because what lies at the heart of us is more than us. And towards the end of the poem, what we have here is him saying, in a way he's saying, well, it's no surprise, is it? No wonder of it. When we plough the earth, the sheer ploughingness of the earth, the plough itself gets burnished. Sheer plod makes plough down Cillian shine, so it could be the plough gets burnished, but also as we plough the earth, we create, in the breaking of the earth, we create the potential for new life. So in that sense of brokenness, the possibility for new life starts to emerge. So we get a sense that at the heart of the world and at the base of this vision of the Windhover, what we get is that the world is intrinsically made for rebirth and resurrection. And then finally, his final image is of how it's almost like him saying, this is just like when it looks like a fire has gone out and you get blue bleak embers and then they drop, the gold bursts out. You get that surprise moment of when you discover when something looks dead, actually it's still alive. You get that brightness burst out. Gash, gold, vermilion. And all of this sense of what lies at the heart of our world, of God's world, which can be that what looks ordinary, sheer plod, what looks infertile, and then there is new growth dug into it. There is at the heart of an ordinary, sometimes bleak world, the reality of God's presence, which he caught from the glimpse of the Windhover. I'm going to leave the Windhover behind at the moment. I am, as I said, always aware that there are so many ways of reading his poems. So if you have a different response to the language, of course, and do follow your responses to them. I'm really aware of the time, so I'm going to just touch on another one, and I'm going to touch on No Worst. I'm only going to say that one at the moment because it's such a great example of a poem from another time in his life. This was one of what's known as the terrible sonnets that he wrote, which is from a period when he really struggled with the world. And these were written in the mid-1880s, these poems. No Worst is one of them. And I mention this one not because it's an especially cheery one, to talk about second, but because it tells us that he was absolutely not afraid of thinking through life's questions and difficulties. And there is in this poem as well what's become a very famous line. So I'll read this. No worst, there is none, pitched past pitch of grief. More pangs will, schooled at 4 pangs, wilder ring. Comforter, where is your comforting? Mary, mother of us, where is your relief? My cries heave herds long, huddle in amain, a chief woe, world's sorrow, on an age-old anvil wince and sing, then lull, then leave off. Fury had shrieked, no lingering, let me be fell, force I must be brief. Oh, the mind has mountains, cliffs of fall, frightful, sheer, no man fathomed, hold them cheap, may who never hung there. Nor does long our small durance deal with that steep or deep. Here, creep wretch under a comfort serves in a whirlwind, all life death does, and each day dies with sleep. As I said, he wrote that at a very difficult time in his life. He was really struggling with his own sense of depression, the difficulty of living in, he didn't really understand how he was being called to live out his vocation at that point. And so this is one of the poems he wrote, which exemplified that sense of sometimes real despair. What we find in this poem is somebody who is absolutely not afraid to shy away from the deep questions. There is a feeling of the psalmist about him, possibly the feeling of Psalm 88 about it. It's not that there is an enormous sense of relief in this poetry, but there is, nevertheless, there's something in it which is about, in these wild storms of life, the encouragement is to creep right into the centre, almost like at that still point where we're in the eye of a storm which rages around us, but possibly we may find that moment of brief respite which can come in sleep as well to the end of the day. But there is here a sense of somebody who really is not afraid to ask the hard questions, who knows what it is to have these herd. It's like a massive herd of cattle he's talking about, this low moan of pain. And also he talks about the kind of the anvil strike of pain. So it's like this sort of sharp wince of pain, these manifestations of pain which may be familiar to each and every one of us in different ways. And he comes in the middle of this poem to this line which has become very well known: the mind has mountains. And the idea that we may find ourselves on the abyss, looking deep down onto the mountain, or looking up at the mountain, and that nobody knows what that's like unless they have encountered the abyss of what he's describing. This poem offers us a completely different glimpse of the same poet. And there are so many poems that he shares with us which give us the sense of joy, which give us a sense of whatever is going on in the world, God is with us, but which also show us that the reality of being human beings, of course, is that we can suffer as intensely as he does too, and find our own ways through it. And for me, there's something really significant, really relevant for Lent in this. And partly when we all find ourselves in some weeks now away from us, we find ourselves in Holy Week, there is something about the reality of staying with the darkness, which is going to be what's required of us as we move ourselves towards the brightness of Easter Day and resurrection. And because of the kind of poet Hopkins is, he gives us the opportunity to do that, I want to say safely, because we can hold and resonate with his experience and know that as we travel through Lent, he will also give us opportunities to travel through and engage with those hints of resurrection, which will enable us on the other side in many weeks' time to reach those glimpses, those realities of God with us in resurrection. I am going to stop. I really want to talk about Felix Randall. I don't have a chance. Read Felix Randall. It's a great poem. It's a poem about a man, a real man who is actually called Felix Spencer, and he nursed him through his journey of death and through faith. And it's a wonderful poem to read. And I'd better stop there, really, except just to say that if you do feel moved to read Hopkins, he is a great companion. I find I'm still discovering so much more when I read his poetry. And the strong encouragement is that when we read him, whilst the language can be quite obscure, quite dense, that the impulse to understand in a kind of, I must grasp this way, if we can sit lightly to that and let the beauty of the language speak, that can be the most fruitful and glorious way to encounter him at his greatest. Thank you. It's a really interesting question because he had been so unstable and that had had particular challenges. The period of stability was when he lived in Dublin. And he was an academic and he was a teacher and he was a classicist at that point. And his main responsibilities were around teaching students. What he found really difficult was the extraordinary volume of work. He felt, even though he had lots of he had lots of friends, colleagues, he still felt very isolated. He felt, this is my understanding of him, he felt very cut off from his own institution. He felt away from his home, the home context he knew really well. He felt in some ways slightly cut off from family too. Family had really struggled with his conversion to Roman Catholicism. So there was a lot of isolation for him. And he wrote in poetry he wrote one poem called To See in the Stranger, or that's what it's become known as, To See in the Stranger, which is about this sense almost of being an exile. And although he lived in reasonable conditions, he lived in the middle of Dublin, there were also quite a lot of difficult unsanitary conditions around too, and that affected his health, and that he was quite delicate. So all of these things fed in. Well, it's a bit of a sliding doors moment, really, isn't it? I mean, I think the sense was, and there's one really superb writer called Paul Mariani on Hopkins, he's worth reading. He talks about this, that he probably would have stayed at St. Bino's. And my understanding from what I've read is that he might have been destined for a different type of ministry in a different type of context in which he would not have been required to move around and to go in all the sorts of ministry he did go into, but to have some more stability in this place, which is where he felt his muse was very close to him, his kind of the home of his heart, which was in North Wales. So probably or possibly he would have stayed there. But I find it impossible to know. There was a sense as he left St. Bino's, though, that this was very, very, very painful for him. And there are all sorts of thoughts about why he might not have got through everything. I mean, all sorts of thoughts, like maybe his theology was a bit more radical than the theology being espoused at the time, or all sorts of things. And there was also a sense of there was some worry about whether his physical fragility, was the impact on him as well. So there's a lot that's been said about those times of transition for him, but it's quite possible that he may have stayed put for longer. That's a good question. It's again, it's hard to know. There was something. I This is an imagination on my part. I don't think he would have encouraged people to pull their socks up. I don't think he would have encouraged easy answers. He may be somebody who would have encouraged the sort of real depth response that is possible in our times. Of course, he wrote well before things that have happened within the last 150 years about uh, the possibility of looking for professional help. I suspect he would always have wanted to have explored the place of God within our lives. But because he was somebody who really seemed genuinely to struggle really authentically with what was going on inside him, I could only see him as being somebody who would encourage people to be equally authentic in their struggles and to pour their hearts out in whatever way, and not expect easy answers. There is poetry which makes it really clear that he wasn't expecting easy answers. He was working away of what was going on. Possibly. I'm just trying to think. There are obviously lots of different editions. What I want to suggest is Robert Bridges' edition of his poetry, which is available online. If you can't get hold of it, through Aid Books or something, it's certainly available online. And for example, that has got a layout which potentially gives you a sense of how the terrible sonnets might fit together. In terms of the scansion marks, oh dear, I'm struggling now. I think, I could be wrong about this, but I think versions of Penguin Classics version have some scansion marks, some, not the whole lot. But I think I'd probably want to go to Robert Bridges or look for some original versions of his manuscripts, which have got some of the marks on. Yeah, I mean, some of the poetry is more often published with the scansion marks than other poems, to be honest. Some of his later poems have more of the scansion marks in. I'm casting around and I can't think of a one that would really help you out there. Sorry. Thank you. They did know each other. They'd met as undergraduates, so they were friends then throughout the rest of his adult life. Of course, again, I don't know specifically, but my understanding is that it was of enormous significance to him. And his correspondence with Robert Bridges is really worth reading. You really get a sense of somebody for whom they provided for each other profound support. So I don't have any doubt that his really strong friendship with Bridges was an enormous support to him, and not just a kind of somebody at the end of a letter who you can say, I'm really struggling at the moment to, that they were peers in terms of writing poetically, and Bridges clearly had the most enormous respect for Hopkins and vice versa. So I think it was a profoundly equivalent and significant friendship.